The Atlantic slave trade is going to be the most impactful and is also going to be the most detrimental trade that we have going on during this time period. And this isn't to say that the other trades that the Europeans are involved in aren't harsh. I mean, the Europeans aren't delicate with what they're doing. They have no problem screwing over people and taking advantage of people that they believe to be lesser in some way, either A, based upon their religion, their lack of Christianity in their minds, or because of their race. Um, the African slave trade is just simply going to be to another level. And this is really an overview. We have a couple other things that we're going to do with the Atlantic slave trade that will kind of fill out some more of this general overview. And it's also something that you should have some familiarity with. So, to start off with, between the mid 15th and mid 19th century, the Atlantic slave trade took an estimated 10.7 million people from Africa to the Americas. And again, this is a ballpark. I've read some texts where the numbers are even higher. And you have to realize that this impact is not only on the people who are ripped from Africa, but then also the generations of Africans that will never exist because those people were taken, died in transit, or displaced to some place far from home. And in fact, you want to put down here next to the unlabeled sentence, you want to put down an average of 50%, an average of 50% died in transit. An average of 50% died in transit. So in transit, I'm looking at not only the slaves crossing the Atlantic Ocean, the mortality there was very high, but also from capture in the interior of Africa, bringing to the coast, holding at the coast, and then going across the Atlantic to the vast majority of them going to the sugar plantations. 50% of all African captured will die somewhere along that route. Um, and of course, millions more here are going to die in the process. I mean, the vastness of the human tragedy just simply cannot be adequately expressed. And the African slave trade is going to transform the societies of all participants. It's not just going to impact directly Africa, but it's also going to impact the colonies substantially as well. And you also have the African diaspora is going to create racially mixed societies in the Americas. Now, what I'd like you to do here, real quick, is I want you to underline diaspora and then draw a little arrow over to the side. And I want to define that for you. Okay? So once you underline diaspora, draw a little arrow over here. And then on the side, you want to put down the definition for it. This is the scattering. This is the scattering of language, culture, and people. This is the scattering of language, culture, and people. In other words, wherever the African slaves go, they are going to impact the society upon which they are thrown into. So there's going to be elements of African religion, of language, of culture, of speech that is going to impact all the places that the slaves are going to be sent. So, the slave trading context, and this is by no means to minimize the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade, because you're going to see that, even though most human societies had slaves, the Atlantic slave trade is going to be something different and unique. It is going to be on a vastly different level in a bunch of different ways. Um, Africans themselves had practiced slavery and sold slaves for centuries. Again, this doesn't minimize what happens by any, you know, means. Um, Slavery is going to take many forms depending on the region and on the time period. I mean, slavery and the slave experience, other than the Atlantic slave trade and different time periods, um, it's going to vary. The Atlantic slave trade, however, is going to be very, very consistent. So, other than the Atlantic slave trade, in these other forms, slaves are going to be often assimilated into their owners' households. Children of slaves were sometimes free, sometimes they're slaves. The Islamic world is going to prefer female slaves. The Atlantic slave trade is going to prefer males. And this is going to be all about the type of labor that is going to be done by the majority of the slaves within the Atlantic slave trade. In the Islamic world, it tends to be more household servants. In the Atlantic world, it's going to be all about the sugar plantations. We'll get into that here in a little bit. The other thing here is, depending on what we're talking about, especially in the Islamic world, not all slaves had lowly position or military status. However, you do want to put down here next to D, underneath number 3, you do want to put down here that all slaves were at the whim of their owners. All slaves were at the whim of their owners. Regardless of where we're talking about, whether we're talking about slavery in the context of the Atlantic slave trade or in the Islamic world or in the ancient world, at the end of the day, slaves are property. And even though in parts of the Islamic world, you could have slaves attend or attain great military prestige or political status, at the end of the day, they're property. And an owner can do with their property whatever it is that they want to do. Now, there are a number of things that will be distinctive of slavery in the Americas. And the biggest one, and you want to go ahead before we highlight it, you want to put a star here by A underneath number 4. The biggest one is going to be the scale and the importance of the slave trade in the Americas. It's just simply enormous. Point blank, American colonies are not built without the use of slave labor. Period. End of statement. I do not care where we are talking about, South America, Central America, or North America. Those colonies are built with the use of slave labor or with the profits of slave labor. They're largely based on plantation agriculture, with slaves denied any rights at all. So there's no possibility of being anything else other than a slave. Slave status here is inherited. If your parents are slaves, you're slaves. There's no maybe, like you have in some of the other societies. There was also very little hope for manumission. And what I want you to do next to manumission here, because you may not know the definition of it, just put in parentheses right next to it, freed from slavery. Freed from slavery. In general, there's very little hope. Now, there will be some instances, and we'll get to this here in a second. Um, but really, you come in to the colonies as a slave, or you're born into slavery, 9.99999 chances out of 10, you're going to die a slave. The possibility of you receiving your freedom is really slim to none. It's also not lost the fact that we have widespread slavery in a society, especially North America, that valued human freedom and stressed equality. I mean, the hypocrisy is not going to be lost, especially when we get to the creation of the United States and we have our founding documents that are going to be expressing the need for freedom and the need for equality, while at the same time, we have fellow human beings enslaved and as property. The other big distinctive feature of slavery in the Americas, and again, before we highlight it, you want to put a star here by F. You want to put down here that slavery was wholly identified with Africa and with blackness. Now, this is something that the Europeans will inherit, or this concept is something that the Europeans will inherit. So we want to put down here next to F, do you want to put down that this comes from the Muslim traders. This comes from the Muslim traders. Now, even though this concept comes from someplace other than the Europeans go to another level with this, where they will become obsessed with blackness and associate all elements of blackness with slavery and slavery with blackness. There's no separating the two. So the origins of the Atlantic slavery is going to lay in the Mediterranean with sugar production. The thing is that sugar production, the work was very difficult and was very dangerous, and slaves were ideal because sugar production is so labor intensive, because it's so deadly. You cannot possibly pay somebody enough money to want to do this work. And if you could pay somebody enough, it's going to mean that sugar, which is already a luxury good at this time, is going to be so expensive that no one is going to be able to afford to buy it. So, slave labor is going to have to be used. At first, Slavs from the Black Sea region provided most slaves for Mediterranean sugar production. Um, in fact, the Slavs at this time, and we'll get a note for this here in a second. Slavs at this time in the Black Sea region are largely Muslim. So you want to put down here next to C, do you want to put down that Slavs were not used after they became Christian? Slavs were not used after they became Christian. This area around the Black Sea region, you have the Ottomans to the south, which is Islamic Empire, and you also, if you remember, back to the building of the Russian Empire, the Russians are retaking that territory from the Mongols. And the Mongols, once they spread into Russia, have converted to Islam. So as they come in, Islam spreads. And a lot of people within this region will have converted to Islam. Once they convert, or in a lot of cases reconvert to Christianity, then they're no longer able to be used as slaves. And in fact, where we get the word slave from is actually from that word Slav. Just, a little bit of FYI here. The Portuguese here are going to find an alternative slave source in West Africa. The Portuguese are going to be the first ones to start the slave trade. The Africans here are going to become the primary source of slave labor in the Americas for a couple reasons. One, Slavs weren't available. The Native Americans died of European diseases because, keep in mind, the Europeans have had some type of contact with Africans off and on, so they don't succumb to the European based diseases as quickly or as frequently as the indigenous Americans do. Europeans are a bad alternative. Christians from marginal lands can't be enslaved because they can't enslave fellow Christians, and indentured servants were expensive. Indenturement is also temporary. You sign up for a term or two of indenturement, and at the end of that, you're free to go about your business and you're entitled to something, either cash or land or both. So indenturement is temporary and it's also expensive. Plus, the Africans were farmers. They had some immunity to European diseases, were not Christian, and in the European mind were widely available. So, in other words, next to this section, this is going to help you like dealing with the review. So, next to A through D here, I want you to do two things. One, put a big star, because this is almost going to be like a GPS, because there's a question that you're going to need for your review that's going to be on your test where these are the answers you want to look for. So put a star over here, and then next to that star, you want to write down reasons reasons for the use of African slaves in the Americas. Reasons for use of African slaves in the Americas. So, the slave trade in practice is pretty straightforward. And the big thing, and you want to put a star here by number one underneath capital B, is the slave trade was driven by European demand. Europeans have a demand for especially sugar and in some other places, some other agricultural products, like eventually, once we get into North America with slaves, with indigo, rice, cotton, tobacco. Um, if you don't have that European demand, then you don't have the demand for the overwhelming labor in order to meet what the Europeans want. But the thing is that the Europeans didn't raid Africa for slaves. They traded freely with African merchants and elites. Again, this is sort of kind of weirdly similar to the trade that was going on in North America with the indigenous population for furs, where for furs, the Europeans were having the Native Americans go out and get the furs. In the slave trade, the Europeans are having African slavers go out into various and sundry African tribes and villages and cities, raiding their populations and then bringing the slaves back to the coast where the Europeans would trade. Again, for much of the same reasons, but with Africa, you're going to throw in another element of tropical diseases that the Europeans don't have any immunity for. So, in other words, from capture to sale on the coast, trade was in African hands. The Africans are going to receive trade goods in return, often bought with American silver. Like I told you earlier in the chapter, silver is going to be global at this point. Silver goes across the Pacific into China. Silver is also going across the Atlantic in order to pay for slaves. We also have an increasing pace of the Atlantic slave trade. Um, you want to put down here next to number three, and this is kind of a little bit of common sense, but just in case, you want to put down this caused a destabilization. This caused a destabilization of African societies. This caused a destabilization of African societies. You can't be ripping millions and millions of people away and out of Africa without it having consequences to the societies in which they're taken from. Period. There's going to be cultural, social, economic, and political consequences in Africa within all of these societies because of the slave trade that's going on. Between 1450 and 1600, fewer than 4,000 slaves were shipped annually. However, you want to put down, I'm sorry, not however, you want to put down here next to A, underneath number three, that the Portuguese wanted other products from Africa. The Portuguese wanted other products from Africa, not just slaves. Not just slaves. From 1450 to 1600, we're really not necessarily as interested in slave labor as we will be a little bit later. Because you think about it, this time period, we're kind of just starting to set up the colonies for a good part of this time period. If we're looking at the Americas, we're still able to technically use what's left of the indigenous population as slaves. In fact, once we're not able to do that anymore, that also is going to be a major reason why we gravitate towards the Africans, because we can no longer enslave the indigenous population. However, once we get settled, or once the Europeans get settled, in the 17th century, an average of 10,000 slaves per year are going to be taken to the Americas. You want to put down, because this is going to grow, you want to put down here next to B, underneath number three, you want to put down the high point by the 1750s, more than 60,000 slaves were brought to the Americas each year. The high point by the 1750s, more than 60,000 slaves were brought to the Americas each year. At this point, when the slave trade is reaching its high point, the Portuguese and the Spanish have been out of it for quite some time. The English are going to be in charge, and they take this slave trade to an absolutely other level. Now, who's going to be enslaved? Realistically, um, it's going to be groups of people that have always been enslaved in a lot of ways. Locationally, we're looking at people from West Africa. It's just a geographical thing. We will have an East African slave trade going on, but that is going to be smaller in number, and that's also going to be in Islamic hands. There are people that are coming from marginal groups like prisoners of war, debtors, and criminals. Now, again, these are people who historically have always, for lack of a better idea, have always been slave fodder. And Africans generally did not sell their own people. Now, what I mean by this, and you want to put a little star here by C, because this oftentimes is, overlooked or oversimplified. Put a little star by C, and then you want to put down here next to C that they are not selling people or members of their own community. They are not selling people or members of their own community. Like they're not going and taking their own. They're not going and taking their next door neighbors and selling them into slavery. Instead, they're going after some distant tribe that they have no allegiance with, and they're raiding them and then taking their population and selling them into slaves. Now, the vast majority of these slaves, and I know we've commented on this before, ended up in Brazil and the Caribbean. In fact, number wise, you want to put down here next to number 5, put down 80 to 85%. 80 to 85%. And remember, the vast majority of slaves are going into the sugar plantations. And the sugar plantations are going to be found in Brazil and the Caribbean. We do have smaller numbers going to North America, mainland Spanish America, or in Europe. And about 15% of those enslaved are going to die during the Middle Passage. I mean, the Middle Passage is going to be one of the most lethal parts. It's going to be that point in which they're going across the Atlantic. The consequences here are going to be big time. So you want to go ahead and put a star by C, because again, I think that there's a couple questions in your review and then on your test about these consequences. So one, it's going to create new trans-regional linkages. You want to put down here next to number 1, it's capital C. Do you want to put down Africa? Africa became a permanent part of the Atlantic world. Africa became a permanent part of the Atlantic world. I mean, it had been in the trade going across the Atlantic a little bit before, but now with the slave trade, they're a massive, if not one of the most important, if not the most important part of the trade that is going on within the Atlantic, certainly the most profitable. It also, a little bit of common sense, is going to slow Africa's growth while Europe and China are going to expand in population. Because remember, we're taking millions and millions of people out of Africa, and those millions of people are either dying on the way to the New World or they're being displaced and sent to the New World, never to be returned. We also have the slave trade generating economic stagnation and political disruption within Africa. And you want to put a little star there by B, because here's the thing. There are going to be people that profit from the trade in slaves, fellow Africans, but they don't invest in production. They make a lot of money being slave traders, but they don't do anything with that money. So even though there is wealth that is being created within Africa because of the slave trade, nothing happens with that wealth. It just sort of kind of sits. Now, social effects, some of this stuff we'll see later in a future chapter because some of these social effects are going to come back and be amplified in the 19th century with new imperialism and is going to still be there by the time we get to new imperialism. The biggest one here is going to be unbalanced sex ratios within Africa. And the reason for this, you want to put this down here next to B, underneath number 3, is more men were sent to plantations. More men were sent to plantations at a 2-to-1 ratio. At a 2-to-1 ratio. So here's the thing. Because the vast majority of these slaves are going to the sugar plantations. Like I've told you before, the labor on the sugar plantations is very demanding. And the physical requirements are more than women or more than the average woman is going to be able to meet. So male labor is going to be preferred. And as a result, more men are going to be involved in the Atlantic slave trade than we see women. Because of this, it's going to increase substantially the labor demands on women. Women are going to basically have to do double duty, and you'll see that they're going to have to do this in future as well. And it's also going to lead to more polygamous households where you're going to have men, some of the men that are left, that are going to have multiple wife households. Now, at the end of the day, the effects of slave trade are going to differ from place to place. You want to go ahead and put a star also by number 5. And some of this is really, kind of common sense. Many small scale kinship societies are going to be thoroughly disrupted. I mean, the smaller the population and the more people you have removed because of the slave trade, the easier that society or that tribe or that kingdom is going to fall apart. In fact, you even have some larger kingdoms that are going to slowly disintegrate here as well. So, it's not like the size of your empire is going to really matter here. It's all about where the slaves are coming from and the number of slaves that are going to go.